Hello, my name is Nadine and welcome to Hoplog Studio. So in today's video, I want to share with you about how you can use grid drawing as a tool to improve your drawing practice. As this month is Inktober, I thought I would share with you a few of the drawing techniques that I use to help me draw quickly and effectively, even though I don't practice drawing a lot. So what is a grid drawing? Basically, it might be hard to see on my paper, but I actually have put in some grid lines. You'll notice that they're all perfect squares. So the idea of grid drawing is that you always do everything in perfect squares. So basically take your ruler, decide on your size. You can do larger squares, smaller squares, depending on what your dimensions of your drawing is. And that's maybe almost where to start. I often will take a look at the size of canvas that I'm using and from there decide on how big my squares I need to be for my reference photo and then draw squares accordingly. So all of these ones on this page are 1 inch by 1 inch. And that's generally a fairly good size for me, and this is a fairly good dimension for me to start with. So when you are taking a look at your reference photo, there's a few things to think about. So basically, there are lots of apps that you can use to put a grid on your pictures. I've actually used it on my phone quite a bit, but sometimes I like using bigger pictures, or I like actually using printed pictures because I do print a lot of my own pictures. So in this case, I actually used a piece of acetate and drew the grid on it with a permanent marker. And so this way I can basically line it up on my image and I can use this as a grid that I'm going to translate to this piece of paper. So before we actually look to move this onto a grid, let's talk about composition. So in this case, I would like to talk about the rule of thirds. So what I've done on this piece of acetate is add my rule of thirds line. You can really do this on any piece of paper or any piece of acetate of any size. So when you're using the rule of thirds, what you want to do is to put 2 horizontal and 2 vertical lines that are an equal distance to each side. So you'll notice that these are more rectangles than squares because you're doing the rule of thirds based off of the length and also the height. So when you do that, this leaves us these 4 spots, and these 4 spots are really your sweet spots for composition. You would really like to have your subject matter to fall into these spots, and by doing so, it makes a much stronger image. The key is to try to keep it out of the center or out of the bottom left corner. You want your image to be strong, and if you're going to spend all this time drawing and all this time or painting or whatever you do with your image, the important thing is to have a strong composition. On this picture here, you'll notice that I already have a strong composition. I use a rule of thirds in most of my photography, so that's why you'll see that this picture, even though I haven't really edited it, has a fairly strong composition. So it touches the beak, the neck, and the body. And those 3 sweet spots make this a really interesting picture to draw. So what if you went into a situation where your composition isn't really perfect? In this case, this picture isn't a super grid composition. You'll notice that the flower falls a little bit to the left, a little bit to the left, and a little bit below those sweet spots. So all you need to do is bring down your grid, bring it a little bit to the left, and now just by doing the small change, you end up having your center of your flowers to be in those sweet spots. So again, we don't have to change everything. We don't necessarily have to print a new picture, but it's being aware so that as you draw, now you can draw with these being in the sweet spots. You change your composition a little bit. It makes for a much stronger overall image. So let's talk about grid drawing. So once you put your grid on here, what do you do next? So in this case, I have a grid that's 5 across and 7 up. And in my case, I have 8 up and 5 across. You're not always going to have a perfect ratio, and so sometimes you might look at it. In this case, I'm going to probably do another square above the flamingo. The other option is you center it so that you have a little bit below and a little bit above. So it's a little bit more that you still keep that nice rule of thirds, but you still have the really nice lines. So basically you start with whatever grid you want to start with. So in my case, I'm going to go to the 3rd grid. So you count over your 3 grids and you take a look at where it falls within the grid. So in this case, I'm just going to move to a darker pencil just so you can see this better. So as I was saying, you can basically look at where that first square is and the angle of that part of the body in that grid. Then you do the next section. And again, this isn't perfect, but the idea is to give you a close enough to help you figure out where you want to have your image and how your images fall. So again, where the neck is coming up, I can look at where it is in the square, and it's getting close to the top of the square and then intersects very slightly with the square above. And what I usually do when I do this is I actually go back in after and I adjust. I take a look at the overall picture and I adjust a little bit. But what's nice about this is it helps you get down your ideas really, really quickly. And one thing I've realized with painting is I can get really caught in trying to get decent composition. I was actually in a drawing class the other day, and what I ran into was that I was watching one of my fellow students, and she was really struggling with composition, and she didn't really want to draw a grid. She didn't really want to take the time to draw a grid. But what was interesting about it was she spent probably a half hour struggling with trying to get her eyes in the right place, try to get her composition good. And in that time, I had drawn my grid. I had actually already completed my drawing, but because I was using a grid. And in this case, I was actually doing 30-inch by 40-inch paintings. You can actually make this really, really large on your paintings to help you be able to get to your next step quicker. And for me, it's been really helpful because I know I'm only so good at painting so far, and I do struggle a little bit with composition. So instead of sitting there and getting caught into the details of having to try to draw my image, and because I enjoy doing animals, I find animals even harder for that. By using composition like this, it saves a lot of time. So when you are doing this on a painting, what's nice about it is you can use chalk pencils, or you can use watercolor crayons. What's nice about them is basically because they do wash off really, really quickly. It isn't a lot of time nor energy to put it in, because usually by the time you start painting over top of it, you're not even going to see it. And so this is where you can leave yourself at a place where you're really encouraging yourself to move to painting or drawing quicker. Comment that my one teacher's always made to me is like, you need to get your ideas down quickly. If you don't get your ideas down quickly, often you lose them. And that can be a really hard thing. It's like you spend all your time messing around with things to the point where you don't actually do what you really wanted to do in the end of the day with your painting. So as you can see, I'm just continuing to work along here. And this flamingo has a really big bill because that's how they eat. So I am making his bill, and this is where it's interesting because often I would probably make his bill smaller if I was freehanding this. And then by actually having the grid, it prevents me from putting in funny angles or maybe under accentuating the size of something. So I find that with a lot of art, I usually end up making my eyes too small often in my artwork for my animals. And so by actually using this type of technique, it can really help you move towards your final picture quicker. So there you go. It's a pretty basic shape. So let's say you want to throw in some ink on this. Because it is Inktober, I would like to actually show you what it would look like with a little bit of ink. So to ink this in, I'm going to use one of my Tombow pens. This has a brush nib, but it's actually fairly stiff, which works really well for this. And so I'm going to go in. I'm going to try to keep this loose. So there's little fuzzies over there. I'm going to try to make them as mark making spots over trying to make them perfect. It's always good to focus on the eyes first because they're the hard part. And sometimes I just like using it as a guide, because often I go in and I do fix this a little bit. Being a bird, they always have those really straight eyes, as like non-pupilled, or their pupils very strange in their eye. Like it's also kind of straight in the center, where most other animals, they're more like us. They don't have their eyeball just perfectly straight. I feel like the more I'm learning about how to draw animals, I realize how much we caricature them by accident, just in our own misunderstanding of what we're observing. And I think this is what I really like about this grid drawing, is it does help with observation. It allows us to kind of see, like, what do we see when we see an object, and how do we represent it? Because it's very easy to almost caricature a lot of the things we see around us. Not on purpose, just out of our own misunderstanding of what we're actually seeing. I know for myself, like being in art classes and seeing more of how professional artists do their work, I get a lot of, well, do you realize you're making your bird look like this? And I'm like, oh, I didn't know that. and that for me has been really great. I realize that drawing has so much to do with observation. I'm trying to kind of show some of the shadows that I have below there. Because again, he's not perfectly... And this picture I actually took at the Calgary Zoo over the summer. We have a really great set of flamingos that are actually residents of our zoo, and they're always doing fun things and bickering away as they feed, and it's really fun to watch. You might see a lot along the beak. It might be really hard to see from the picture, but there is like little hatch marks. So I'm going to try to include those. And there's a bit more of a curve in the beak there, so I'm going to try to thicken that up a little bit. I think that might be a nostril there. I'm not positive. And so the key to this is, how do we do these dark spots? I'm going to try to represent it a little bit, like as cross-hatching. Again, I struggle a little bit with pen and ink drawing. It's not something I do a lot of, and I love pen and ink, but I've realized that it's something I definitely need to work on my skills for. But for this demonstration, I'm just going to show you kind of what I would do just to get a concept down. Often I also use my drawing to be able to just be the basis of my painting. So the more comfortable you are with an item that you are trying to draw, the better it goes. So it's something to think about as you work. And so in this case, I am now going to get rid of my grid. So now that I've done all my erasing, I'm going to do a couple... I think I'm going to deepen this a little bit. You want to try to emulate the idea of more black. And I might try a different pen and see if that helps as well. Yeah, there we go. Because all the different pens have slightly different inks, so by putting in maybe a slightly different black than what you do have, it can help you darken things up a bit, have them look a little bit a little bit more real in the way that you would like it to be. And again, the whole point of this was to be fairly loose. And also the other point wasn't to actually spend all my time getting every detail. That really wasn't the point of this drawing. It was to give a sense of idea, of shape. A sense of feathers, but again, the whole point isn't to draw in every single detail. But this is also where using different markers with different thicknesses can give you some really interesting mark making. So I'm pretty happy with that. I think this isn't, I really try to keep a loose feeling to my sketching. I do struggle with trying to get every detail and have it be perfect all the time. So for me, this is a pretty good representation of this drawing. So I hope that you have enjoyed this video and that you've learned something about grid drawing. Please give it a try. I have to say I use it for a lot of my paintings, especially my large ones. It's a really great way of getting your ideas down quickly and being able to really progress in your drawing skill. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, if you like it, subscribe to my channel and maybe provide a comment below about what you liked about this video. As well, I have my website, hopalongstudio.com, where I have other ideas on how to build your creative practice. I hope you have a really great week, and I will see you next time.